with the Indian population, sepoy or civilian, took measures to secure themselves against copycat uprisings in the Strait settlements, and in Trinidad the annual wholesale processions were banned. Riots broke out in the penal settlements in Burma and the settlements in Penang. The loss of a musket provoked a near riot, and security was boosted, essentially in locations with Indian convicted populations. From the end of 1857, the British had begun to gain ground again. Lucknow was retaken in March 1858. On the 8th of July 58, a peace treaty was signed and the rebellion ended. The last rebels were defeated in Gwalior on the 20th of June 1858. By 1859, rebel leaders Buck Khan and Nana Shihab had soon either been slain or had fled. The rebel murder of women, children and wounded soldiers at Cawnpur and the subsequent printing of the sieges at British papers left many British soldiers seeking revenge. As well as hanging mutineers, the British had some, quote, blown from cannon, quote, which was an old Mongol punishment adopted many years before in India. Sentenced rebels were then tied over mouths of cannons and blown to pieces when the gun was fired. Most of the British press, outraged by the reports of rape and the killings of civilians and wounded soldiers, did not advocate clemency of any kind. Governor-General Canning ordered moderation in dealing with native sensibilities and earned the scornful title Clemency Canning from the press and later parts of the British public. In terms of sheer numbers, the casualties were much higher on the Indian side. A letter published after the fall of Delhi in the Bombay Telegraph was produced in British papers, testified to the scale of Indian casualties. Quote, all the cities people founded within the walls of the city of Delhi when our troops entered were benefited on the spot, and the number was considerable, as many may suppose, where I tell you that in some houses 40 and 50 people were hiding. These were not mutineers, but residents of the city who were trusted and well known, marred rule from pardon. I'm glad to say that they were disappointed. End quote. Edward Verber, a 19-year-old officer, recorded his experience. Quote, it was literally murder. I have seen many bloody and awful sights lately, but such as one I witnessed yesterday, I pray I never see again. The women were all spared, but their screams and seeing their husbands and sons butchered was most painful. Heaven knows I feel no pity, but when old grey-bearded men is brought and shot before our very eyes, hard must be that a man's heart, I think, cannot look upon with indifference. End quote. Some British troops adopted a policy of no prisoners. One officer, Thomas Lowe, remembered on one occasion his unit had taken 76 prisoners. They were just too tired to carry on killing and needed a rest, he later recorded. Later, after a quick trial, the prisoners were lined up with a British soldier standing a couple of yards in front of them. On the order of fire, they all simultaneously shot, quote, swept from their earthly existence, unquote. The aftermath of the rebellion had been a focus of new work using Indian sources and population studies. In the last Mongol, historian William Dalrymple examines the effects of the Muslim population of Delhi after the city was retaken by the British, and finds that intellectual and economic control of the city shifted from Muslim to Hindu hands because the British at that time saw an Islamic hand behind the mutiny. The scale of the punishment handed out by the British Army of retribution was considered largely appropriate and justified in the Britain shocked by reports of atrocities carried out by British and European civilians and local Christians by the rebels. Accounts of the frequently reached hyperbolic register, and according to Christopher Herbert, especially in the often repeated claim that the Red Year of 1857 marked a terrible break in British experience. Such was the atmosphere, and national, quote, mood of retribution and despair, unquote, led to, quote, almost universal approval, unquote, of the measures taken to pacify the revolt. The incidents of rape committed by Indian rebels against European women and girls appalled the British public. These atrocities were often used to justify the British reaction to the rebels. British newspapers printed various eyewitness accounts of the rape of English women and girls. On such account published by the Times regarding an incident where 48 British girls as young as 10 had been raped by Indian rebels in Delhi. Karl Marx later claimed that this was a propaganda, stating that the account was written by a clergyman in Bangalore far from the events of the rebellion, but produced no evidence to support this allegation. Individual incidents captured the public interest and were heavily reported to press. One such incident, that of General Wheeler's daughter Margaret, began forced to live after her captures concubine, though this was reported in the Victorian public as Margaret killing her rapist herself. Another version of this story suggests that Margaret had been killed after her abductor had argued with his wife over her. The term sepoy or sepoyism became a derogatory term for the nationalists, especially in Ireland. Bangalore Sudha was tried for treason by a military commission assembled by Delhi and exiled to Rangoon, where he died in 1862, bringing the Mughal dynasty to an end. In 1877, Queen Victoria took the title of Empress of India on the advice of Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli. The rebellion saw the end of the British East India Company rule in India. In August, by the Government of Indian Act 1858, the company was formally dissolved and its ruling powers over India was transferred to the British Crown. A new British government department, the Indian Office, was created to handle the governance of India, and its head, the Secretary of State for India, was entrusted with formulating an Indian policy. The Governor-General of India gained a new title, the Viceroy of India, and implemented the policies devised by the Indian Office. Some former East Indian territories, such as the Straits Settlements, became colonies in their own right. The British colonial administration embarked on a program of reform, trying to integrate Indian higher castes and rulers into the government and abolish attempts at westernization. The Viceroy stopped land grabs, decreed religious tolerance, and admitted Indians into civil service, albeit as subordinates. Essentially, the old East Indian Company bureaucracy remained, though there was a major shift in attitudes. In looking for the causes of mutiny, the authorities alighted to two things: rebellion and economy. On the rebellion, it was felt that there had been too much interference with indigenous traditions, both Hindu and Muslim. On the economy, it was not believed that the previous attempts by the company to introduce free market competition had undermined traditional power structures and bonds of loyalty, placing the peasantry at the mercy of merchants and moneylenders. In consequence, the British Raj was constructed in part around a conservative agenda based on preservation of tradition and hierarchy. On a political level, it is also felt that the previous lack of consultation between rulers and ruled had yet another significant factor contributing to the uprising. In consequence, the Indians were drawn into government at local level, though there was a limited scale on crucial precedent which had been set with the creation of a new white-collar Indian elite. Further stimulated by the opening of universities at Calcutta, Bombay and Madras, a result of Indian Universities Act. So alongside the values of traditional and ancient India, a new professional middle class was starting to arise, in no way bound by the values of the past. Their ambition can only have been stimulated by Victoria's proclamation of November 1858, in which it is expressly stated that, quote, "We hold ourselves bound to the natives of our Indian territories by the same obligations of duty which bind us to our other subjects. It is our further will that our subjects of whatever creed or race, by freely and impartially admitted to offices in our service, the duties of which may be qualified by their education, ability, and integrity duly to discharge." End quote. Acting on these sentiments, Lord Ripon, Viceroy between 1880 to 85, extended the powers of local self-government and sought to remove racial practices in the law courts by the Ilbert Bill. But a policy as such liberal and progression as one term was revolutionary and backward at the next, creating new elites and confirming old attitudes. The Ilbert Bill only had the effect of causing a white mutiny at the end of prospect of perfect equality by law. In 1886, measures were adopted to restrict Indian entry into the civil service. The Bengal army dominated the Indian army before 1857, and a direct result after the rebellion was the scaling back of the size of the Bengali contingent in the army. The Brahmin presence in the Bengal army was reduced to the late 19th century because of their perceived primary role as mutineers. The British looked for increased recruitment in the Punjab from the Bengal army as a result of the apparent discontent that resulted in the Sepoy conflict. The rebellion transformed both the native and European armies of the British India. Of 74 regular Bengal native infantry regiments in existence at the beginning of 1857, only 12 escaped mutiny or disbandment. All 10 of the Bengal light cavalry regiments were lost. The old Bengal army had accordingly almost completely vanished from order of battle. These troops were replaced by new units recruited from castes hitherto underutilised by the British from the minority so-called martial races, such as the Sikhs and the Gurkhas. The inefficiencies of the old organisation, which had estranged sepoys from the British officers, were addressed, and the post-1857 units were mainly organised on the irregular system. Before the rebellion, each Bengal native infantry regiment had 26 British officers who held every position of authority down to the second in command of each company. In irregular units, there were few European officers who associated themselves far more closely with their soldiers, while more responsibility was given to Indian officers. The British increased the ratio of British to Indian soldiers within India. From 1861, Indian artillery was replaced by British units, except for a few mountain batteries. The post-rebellion changes formed the basis of the military organisation of British India until the earlier 20th century. Thank you for listening to Part 2, The Indian Mutiny by Brief History podcast. As always, the success of this podcast relies on you, the listener, so please listen, subscribe, share, follow us on Twitter at BHistoryPodcast. We're on Facebook, facebook.com/Brief History Podcast. Please like, share, follow, rate us on iTunes and any other podcast site. As always, thank you. My name's Andrew Knight. I'm the narrator and the writer. Harry Edmondson is the composer and the producer. Thanks for listening, and as always, further information will be found in the podcast notes. Listen out for the next episode next week.